Hello, my name is Vilde Nygaard. This spring I finished my master's studies in nature-based tourism, and my master thesis was titled Ethical Dilemmas in Wildlife Photography. My research aimed to explore what Norwegian wildlife photographers think about using bait and staging the wilderness when photographing large Scandinavian carnivores. In this presentation, I'm going to present to you the background for my studies, my method, the informants, some of the results, and the conclusion I made. Wildlife photography is a growing phenomenon in Scandinavia. My work is based on research on wildlife tourism because of tourism and photographing has several things in common. Especially they use the same techniques to get the animals close for viewing. And as most forms of wildlife tourism, wildlife photography may have negative impacts on both wildlife itself and people's perception of wildlife. But it can also contribute to a greater awareness of nature diversity. It is interesting to investigate people's ethics in relation to wildlife photography. It can help us understand why some practices are done and who we should encourage to discuss the ethical questions regarding wildlife tourism or wildlife photography. My work explored photographers' perceptions on the phenomena wild animals and wilderness. Furthermore, I investigated how they reflected upon facilitating or manipulating both the wildlife itself by using bait and the wilderness that serves as a backdrop in a wildlife photography. To investigate these issues, the main research questions were: what do the photographer think about baiting to make wild animals viewable? What do the photographers think about physical manipulation in the field? And what do they think is bad practice in facilitation? Data were collected through semi-structured interviews with semi-professional and a few serious amateur photographers. Some of the informants used to be photographers, but now work mostly as guides and facilitators of photography tours and do not take as much photograph themselves anymore. The photographers plan their projects carefully. They plan their pictures a long time before they go out in the field. They know exactly what pictures they want and need to take. Many have great knowledge about biology or ecology, and they often use social media to teach people about nature diversity. Several of the informants mentioned that it is especially hard nowadays to stand out as a professional photographer because of social media and affordable high-quality cameras. More people take very good pictures, and they go places where other photographers visit. The originality of these pictures are therefore decreased. So the informants have to work harder than ever before to try to get animals in new settings, in example, light, perspectives, or actions. When talking about how to get the animals close to the camera, they mentioned that they had to use bait. In Norway, some wild animals are difficult to capture on camera, among other things because there are strict regulations on baiting. Therefore, going to Finland with a guide is often the best opportunity to photograph the Scandinavian species. According to the informants, the most common bait used in Finland are pig, pellets, fish and honey. They place the bait strategically near or on locations where they want the animals to come or pass by. Some of the informants have had a long partnership and friendship with the local business owners. They said that they were more or less free to place the bait at whatever location they would like to use, but this seemed otherwise to be regulated. As for the scenery, it was carefully selected. It could be a marsh covered with cotton grass, on a hill with a view over a lake, a waterhole in front of a forest, places that would make the animals more viewable or contribute to enhance a feeling of something the photographer looked for. The informants also mentioned so-called disturbing elements that were removed to improve the quality of their photos. Small branches, hair strands, leaves, cones, to handle smaller disturbing elements right in front of the camera, the informants cleaned the foreground. As for bigger disturbing elements, like when the background, for example, included power poles or was just not what the photographer wanted, they would move the camera away from the disturbing element and photograph somewhere else. In Finland, some of the local guides used snowmobiles even in the summer to place big pigs in the marsh. The ground would end up being torn up and most pictures therefore were taken where the marsh still was pretty intact. Additionally, when the photographers talked about photographing smaller animals, they often mentioned that they would manipulate the area by putting up branches and trees that they could move to get a suitable background. Though some said that doing such manipulation as putting up branches and trees was only acceptable when photographing little birds in the garden. And on the other hand, those informants that used props said it helped to enhance the feeling of a pristine environment. The informants were aware how the production of certain types of images create an experience that nature is in balance and in a non-hostile environment. The informants are torn between pleasing their audience, who wants extraordinary pictures, and being mediators to tell what is really happening in nature. Organized Norwegian photographers must follow the organization rules and guidelines, which are all expressing that using bait and staging the scenery is generally accepted if it's done correctly. Even though the informants try to tread carefully and capture the animal on the animal's premises, some photographers talked about how they would try to challenge both themselves and the animal's boundaries in getting the best picture. I believe that the feelings of control, knowledge, and competition affects the judgment that are made in the specific on-site situation. Some of the informants defended some of their actions by explaining that they knew the animal's biology, They knew that the photographers did very little harm and that the affected animals were only a few of the total population. This means that many different assessments of the photo organization guidelines are exercised. And the only way to get a change is that violations are exposed or people get confronted with it. Some of the informants said that they tried to report if they saw a violation being committed. Such whistleblowers are important contributors to develop a better ethical judgment amongst the photographers. Also, regarding bait, the informants felt that bait did not influence the feeling of the animal's natural behavior and wildness. Hence, the animal approached it by free will, they thought. The majority of these informants did not feel any ethical issues with using bait on wildlife. They highlighted several reasons for this. The animals have a diverse nutrition. A piece of meat would not affect that nutrition. Baiting has been legal for a long time in Scandinavia and until recently also in Norway. And it is a socially accepted method in wildlife-related activities and the spatial context of wildlife encounters. Paradoxically, several of the informants express cognitive dissonance by wanting to meet and photograph the animals at a random meeting and not on bait. There is thus no undisputed agreement that bait is either good or bad practice, and it is rather a philosophical question. I am questioning if it is our right as humans to use wildlife as an amusement or source of revenue through tourism. I think it is important to challenge the traditional values in wildlife tourism and wildlife photography if human-wildlife interactions are to develop in a sustainable direction that benefits animal welfare. It is important that stakeholders are aware of the mentioned social, ecological, and animal welfare consequences as popularity of wildlife photography increases. The practice of wildlife photography should involve all stakeholders in the process of making wildlife photography more sustainable. I think that's it. Thank you so much for your attention.